Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
Yo, Daph, what's going on? What's going on?
Nothing much. Just getting ready for Thanksgiving. I've spent the last couple of weeks trying to diet a little bit in preparation for, sadly, binging on macaroni and yams.
It's funny. People dying right before for the holidays. I mean, it's real though. You kind of gotta get ready, clear your system out, because you don't want to pass up on that good eating that comes around. This is only about once a year, maybe twice if you're lucky.
Yeah, and the sad thing is, you're not going to pass up on it. So it's just kind of like, try to do it's like a preemptive strike, You just want to lose a couple pounds because you're probably going to gain a couple. And summer bodies are made in the winter, Yeah, I'm not trying to start January, with a new resolution about trying to lose weight. No, I'm enjoy that day. I'm gonna try to be healthy up until then, and then I'm a grub.
Enjoy it. Well, any plans for Thanksgiving?
I house hop on Thanksgiving, so I'll start at my mom's house. She is usually done early and just want to chill, and so I'll then visit some of my relatives that I haven't seen in a while.
Nice. Yeah, I think we're just chilling this Thanksgiving. Just me and Kristen. We'll just be.
Oh, that's so sweet. Y'all gonna cook y'all first meal?
We did that last Thanksgiving too. Yeah, that was our first. It was right a couple weeks after the wedding, so we was like, let's do it ourselves. And so we're gonna do that again this Thanksgiving. Cook a little something up.
You gonna be watching football? Have you started back watching football?
No, I've really been good. I've watched highlights and stuff, to keep up what's going on, but I haven't been watching games, full games in their live and all that kind of stuff. But I must say that Monday's game, I don't know if I'll be able to resist the Monday Night Football game.
Who's playing Monday?
It's the Rams and the Chiefs, and they're both 9-1 and the top teams in the NFL right now. Yeah. And so it just looks like it's going to be, and I like the Chiefs quarterback, man. He's this young black kid who's doing really well. Patrick Mohan, what's his last name? I can't remember.
Mohan? I don't know. I don't know. I'm just making up stuff. It's funny because I do know, I think John has been pretty good, but he definitely flew to New Orleans for the Saints Patriots.
Okay.
He was like, I have to watch it.
Is that today? When is it?
It was this past weekend.
Oh, it was the past week. Okay. The Saints. He's a Saints fan.
Yeah. So he's from Houston. So I just think I feel like Texas, New Orleans people, they kind of get down together. And I think it was because the Patriots, didn't they win last year or something? The Super Bowl?
Yeah. Did they? Yeah, I think they did. Right. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't been keeping up with the NFL.
Look at you. Look at you. I know. It's we all are weak sometimes. We all fall down sometimes. So, as long as you ain't, trying to get them a bunch of money and stuff.
But. Oh, yeah, not the case. But yeah, okay. Other than that, let's got some old Lord news ready to pop off.
Yes.
All right, let's get into it.
Hello, and welcome to BHD News, where we give you the most current and eye-opening oh Lord news of the week. Join us as we present news that'll make you want to say,
Okay, so this is, I guess today's segment can be just doing what you're supposed to do while Black or working while Black. And so I'll have a few stories about that. And this first one is really sad, and it makes me think about our gun episode and whether there's a such thing as a good guy with a gun and whether you can be a Black good guy with a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure you heard about Jamel Roberson, who was at a bar. He was a security guard. Some people got into an argument and one of the guys started shooting. He bravely kind of pins the guy down. He has him under control. And because this guy had a gun, Jamel took his gun out. He, had it out, just kind of like a don't move type of situation. The police come in and immediately shoot him. As people are yelling, he's the security guard. He's the security guard. It did not matter.
Mm.
The good guy with the gun was shot by police.
Again, us black folk, man, we can't believe these phrases, a good guy with the gun. No, that is, and code word is white male with a gun will be perceived as good guy with a gun. Anybody else with a gun, especially a person of color, you will not be perceived as a good guy. And even though you have within your rights and having to legally doing the right thing with your gun, still getting shot. Man, it's so sad.
And
it's
even
so
thinking about in the past case where the guy had, his gun license, he was telling the police officer, like, I have a gun and a license on me, boom, shot. And so it continues to happen, and it's sad. Don't believe the lies about the supposedly good guy with a gun. And everybody's Second Amendment right to carry is not respected in the same way.
It's not.
So come on, NRA. If you're going to be a civil rights organization, be a civil rights organization for everybody.
Where you at? Where are you at?
So this second story, it happened in Washington, the state. A guy named Byron Ragland was sitting at a Menchie's frozen yogurt shop. He was there as a special advocate and visitation supervisor for the court. So he was supervising a visit between a mother and her son. Well, he had the police called on him because he was labeled as an unwanted person in the Menchie's. What made him unwanted? He was sitting there and doing nothing. That's literally what they said.
That's literally what they said? That's crazy.
Yes, that he was sitting there. When they described what he was doing, they said it was an African-American man. He's looking at his phone and then he'll look up. And then he'll look back down at his phone and look up.
You gotta be kidding me, man. And so the police came because of that?
The police came and still asked him to leave. They asked him what he was doing there. He explained, and they still told him that he needed to move along.
That's insane.
Like he was I don't know, like a dog, move along. Like that's what he said. It felt like you treated me like a stray dog or something.
Wow, like you literally called and said he's looking at his phone and looking up.
Yes, looking at his phone and looking up.
Oh my goodness. I don't even know.
And it was crazy because it wasn't even the workers that called. They text the owner of the store, who then called the police and was like, oh, this man looks suspicious. Looking at your phone and looking up looks suspicious. He's there doing his job. They even saw him walk in with the mother and son who were white. But because he was sitting, the Menchie's owner kind of came out and was like, it's not racism. I'm Asian. Like, we just didn't know because he was sitting adjacent to the people. How about you ask him? It's not like he's brandishing a gun. He's sitting there looking at a phone. Like, you could have asked.
Man, people are like, you calling the cops for like ridiculous things or whatever consequences happen to these businesses, they deserve it.
Yeah, they do. They do. And people, you should see that. You should see that Facebook. The owner ended up writing a long Facebook post. I
bet he did.
Yes, he did. I did the little angry Facebook. The reaction, how you do like. I did the little anger thing. I don't believe you. Okay, I have two more stories. The third story, this is silly. So a local man in Virginia, Lynchburg, Virginia, was awarded for his hard work. He was giving Employee of the Month at Sam's Club. And of course, they wanted to take a picture of him and post it on the wall. It just so happened that he had on a Black Panther shirt, the comic book shirt. Well, a customer saw the picture on the wall and called Sam's Club to complain and said that it would be an outrage or an uproar if, an employee was wearing a KKK shirt. So, of course, why are they letting him wear a Black Panther shirt?
What? Wait, so you said the Black Panther shirt was from the superhero?
Yes, and when you look at the picture, you can see the characters on the shirt. Like, it's not no Huey Newton picture on the shirt. It literally says Black Panther, and like his arms are kind of covering it, but you can see the Black Panther figure and two cartoonish figures standing beside him.
Wow, this life is getting worse and worse, man. You can't look at your phone and look up. You can't wear a superhero shirt. This is crazy.
So Sam's Club asked him, would he be willing to retake the picture to kind of appease the customer? And he said no. And, good thing is Sam's Club was like, we support our employee. Sam's Club probably want to make everybody happy. I'm happy they didn't, retaliate against the worker when he was like, nah, because there's nothing wrong with this shirt.
This is crazy. I'm writing down on my notebook right now, like, we got to do a topic or find somebody. It's probably going to be a white person, but who does research on just like white fears, something like that. It gotta be somebody out there, because we got to have a discussion on this. Yes. This is crazy.
And speaking of fears, okay, this last story is about being the oppressor's worst fear, an intelligent Black person. So did you hear about a Virginia Tech freshman? His name is Landers Nolly, and he's a freshman forward for Virginia Tech, but he was not cleared by the NCAA. Ask me why, Ty.
Why?
Because they thought his ACT scores were suspiciously high.
Oh my goodness, man.
He cannot be cleared until he retakes the test.
Oh, hell no. That got to be some violation or something.
He actually did retake it because they were steadfast.
He retook it? Oh my God.
So we're waiting on the scores, but people that describe him has said that he's always been a scholar athlete, and what made them suspicious is because they say his GPA didn't match his high ACT scores. I mean, that's actually not out of the ordinary. Like, there's some people who have lower GPAs, but they score well on like standardized tests because they have this natural ability. Like, those are two different things.
Yeah, that's ridiculous, man. Yo, I can't believe it. Oh, we got a Black athlete here, and he looks a little too smart. So we go like, what?
Now, mind you, audience, if you do not know, when it comes to these tests, people have to have like, IDs. Like, it is not easy to go there and pose as someone else.
Yeah, you can't do that.
You can't. So it's just kind of like, I really hope his score matches his last score and that he's able to shut them up. Like, yo.
Yeah. And if I was a sociologist on that campus, I'd be immediately about to do some research. Like, all right, let's look at your athletes for the past 10 years. Let's look at their GPAs and their ACT or SAT scores, and let's see the gap, And was this racially profiling? You red flag in this guy? Because I'm sure that's common.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not an uncommon thing of like,
yeah, because athletes, if your athletic ability is great enough to where you end up playing for like a Division I school, it's very likely that in high school you are practicing a lot, playing a lot, and that could just have easily impacted your GPA as your like intellectual ability. So it's just kind of like, I think that's silly. It's silly.
Yeah, it is. That's crazy. Okay. Oh my God.
You see all the things you can't do while being Black.
All the things, just add, the list just keeps on growing and growing. Every other week is something new, man.
Because you're suspicious. You are
It's just suspicious, man. Can't even stay at home, man. It's like, you even want to do that. Like, man, I don't want to go outside no more, but Popo want to come knocking at your door. Get you there too. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh my God. All right. Well, okay, so bringing us to the very special guest we have today is Dr. Nicole Van Cleave, who's an associate professor at University of Delaware. And she pretty much is here to talk about her book, Crook County, which is a book where she did ethnographic work at the Cook County jail and court system, observing them for over 1,000 hours of observations in the Cook County courthouse in Chicago.
Yes.
And so her book speaks to really a lot of the racism that goes on that we just don't hear about. You know, a lot of the research talks about the after effects, looking at stats and looking at the inequalities. But her book really takes a deep dive in looking at, well, how do these inequalities actually present themselves in the courtroom and the everyday practices of the courts, with all the court actors, from the judges to the prosecutors to the defense attorneys to the clerks and everyone. So it's a really, really interesting book, and we're glad that we had the opportunity to come, for her to come talk to us and chat about her work.
Yes. Very, very amazing work. In-depth research. Is won awards. You know, she's been on Rachel Maddow. She's been on NBC News, all of these places, because, you know, there are often questions about what causes these racial disparities. And I think her book does a really good job of helping us to see how these, like Ty said, these everyday practices result in some of the outcomes that we see in the criminal justice system. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And even in one interesting thing, to pay attention to in the conversations too, is her book also talks about some of the conversations that take place when we see these kind of major police brutality cases, killing unarmed Black men, and how, it affects the courtroom culture and the conversations that happen behind closed doors that we really don't hear about, like when these things happen. We hear everybody in the news and the media, but it's interesting to see the perspective of like, what are these lawyers and prosecutors, or how are they taking this in as it's happening in real time and working these cases as well. So it's really good stuff that I'm sure you all will gain from it. And we learned a lot from it, and definitely check out her book, Crook County, if you get a chance, for sure. Other than that, ready to get into it, Dad?
Yes, I am.
All right, we'll catch up with y'all afterwards.
In recent years, policymakers, activists, and the mainstream media have given increased attention to racial disparities within the criminal justice system. However, some skeptics have raised questions about whether statistics highlighting racial disparities are a result of racism or some other cause. Today, we provide insight into the role of race, racism, and discrimination in shaping legal outcomes by interviewing Dr. Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, an associate professor at the University of Delaware in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. Her research explores the contradictory ways that racial stigma is reproduced by the criminal justice system in a purportedly colorblind era. We'll discuss her book, Crook County, and how everyday racism within the justice system perpetuates racial inequality. Welcome, Dr. Van Cleve.
Thank you for having me.
No, thanks for joining us. So one of the first things we like to do, of course, with our guests is just to get our guests to introduce themselves to our audience. So can you just tell our guests and our listeners a little bit about yourself and kind of what sparked your interest in sociology and criminal justice and the work that you do?
Yeah, I'm currently an associate professor at the University of Delaware in their Department of Sociology and Criminology. And I got my PhD at Northwestern University. And I was, there, I had this long history of studying sociology there. As an undergrad, I was a first generation college student, and I was really hungry to kind of understand my own life and lineage. And sociology seemed, I know for many, scholars of color and for many first gen students, it felt like a very natural fit, that it helped me understand my own identity, my own life. And I started there as an undergrad, and that's where I first started to explore the criminal court system and the criminal justice system more broadly. I applied to be law clerk in the prosecution's office. And back in the day, and I think they actually still have this program, Northwestern had this amazing opportunity for undergrads where you could go do field work at a field site of your choice. And I really thought I wanted to be a prosecutor to prosecute crimes against women, sexual assault and other types of things that might have, made women vulnerable. So I really thought that going to the prosecutor's office would enable me to do great social justice work on behalf of women. And of course, when I got there, what I saw was just a stream of Black and Latino defendants, young, charged with mostly nonviolent crimes. And so my senses were assaulted by this idea that our court system was so invested in criminalizing these young people that could be my, brother, cousin, neighbor. And as a light-skinned person of color, I had a very unique vantage point, is that I soon realized that the prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys around me assumed me to be white. So they used my education at Northwestern or my affiliation with the university as kind of a proxy for, well, she must be white and she must have whiteness. And they were super candid with me about their jobs, their ethics, how they think about themselves within the criminal justice system, either, how they pursue convictions, and also their racial views. And so that was the kind of entry point into what became the book Crook County, which was really a decade-long investigation, not just of the criminal justice system, but of racism in America and how our court system has become, in some ways a vehicle through which mostly white attorneys, upscale, educated, can make decisions about the morality and quote unquote immorality of low-income people of color. And in that kind of environment, when you task these mostly white professionals with doing that, you really get in some ways a case study of how racism can fester in institutions that are purportedly colorblind.
That's really insightful. And I know your book is based on more than 1,000 hours of observations in the Cook County courthouse in Chicago. And so you've kind of spoken a little bit about your experiences in the field, how your positionality, your, physical appearance, helped you to gain access. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experiences, some of the things you heard, and also any potential collecting this data.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it started as this it started as an ethnography or a fieldwork assignment as an undergrad. And then, I went back as a PhD student to further continue that ethnography. But I felt like as a woman of color, even as a woman of color with light skin and the privilege that comes with that, I really felt, as a joke, I used to say, who's going to believe Jenny from the block when she says she has data about the pervasiveness of racism by prosecutors and judges and even defense attorneys? And so it was kind of that anxiety of not feeling like anyone would listen or believe me that made me think about, how do I innovate my methods to go beyond what traditional ethnography does? And I had spoken with Elijah Anderson when I was writing this book and researching this book. And he had said to me, just go thick with the description, right? Describe this culture, right? This court culture. And I remember thinking in my head, well, that's great when you're studying marginalized people of color. But when you study powerful people with the most power to inflict the greatest harm, is description enough? Or are people going to hold you to a different standard, an unfair standard maybe, but a different one? And that's where I did criminal court watching. That was actually the 1,000 hours on top of the ethnography that I did in order to, in some ways, isolate race and show how it was working. I had a lot of professors that pushed back on me. And anytime I would find abuse that I would see as being blatantly racialized. So, for instance, a man asking for a trial and the sheriffs were cruel enough to take a wire, wrap it around his chair and plug him into the wall during the trial as though he was going to be executed. I mean, to me, that seemed extremely abusive. It reminded me of Abu Ghraib, where they were putting the fake wires around that gentleman as they tortured him into thinking he was going to be electrocuted. And to me, that seemed like a racialized image, one in which we were seeing on a national scale. But to some white faculty members and many cynics, they were saying, well, how do you know that's not class stigma? And so the court watching effort that I did allowed for me to, in some ways, isolate race. I sent in 130 research assistants over 2 years, and they had different racial backgrounds. So I oversampled researchers of color. And instead of them walking and doing court observations as professionals, meaning they weren't wearing suits, I had them wear jeans and hoodies and ball caps and dress as the everyday public. So these researchers in some ways could take additional observations of the pervasiveness of abuse, but I could also kind of secretly test how they were being treated based on their race. And that's where you really saw how race was operative. All the researchers of color, even if they were from University of Chicago Law School or Northwestern, were asked if they were criminal defendants. They were treated as criminals. They were, searched more seriously at the security gates. Whereas the white researchers, one of two things happened. The white researchers were stopped and assumed to be journalists. So sometimes they were treated hostilely because they were perceived as a threat. Meaning, oh, this is a white person that we don't know. So maybe they're a muckraker or somebody who's going to blow the whistle on what we do here. So they were treated very hostilely, intimidated. One white researcher was brought to to sit in the witness stand by a judge and felt scared and uncomfortable to leave. The other set of white researchers were in some ways treated like VIPs. And so the sheriffs would say, oh, we got great gruesome trials to show you. And there's a trial in courtroom 302 where a guy hacked up the whole family. And so in some ways they would parade the suffering of Black and brown families as though it was for the entertainment of whites. So, when you saw the data coming from this court watching, it really helped dispel any type of critique, whether cynicism or whether people just trying to push the boundaries of the empirical aspect of this work to the next level. But you could start to dispel that idea that it wasn't about race, that it was about something else. And when you're doing a book about racism and you start it in the era of Obama, that was a big challenge to overcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quick follow-up question before we get to some more of the content of your book. What advice would you give to somebody who may want to pursue this kind of line of research and be in the court systems and get that kind of access? What are maybe a couple of quick tips you would give to them to help them in that pursuit?
I guess it depends on what their identity is. I mean, I've often said that I think it is extremely hard to when you're a person of color, it is hard to get candid data on white racism because whites are, especially really educated whites, are extremely sophisticated in how they're able to hide or cloak their racism and non-racist rhetoric, right? We know that. So I think, I joke that I had a lot of fun when it was clear that I was passing as white, and I knew that the candidness of my responses, like I could basically go into this community and be undetected and get people's true views on race in America, especially at a place that's supposedly as sacred as our courts. And so the advice I would say for people, especially white folks that want to be advocates, I used to constantly wonder, why didn't another researcher do this study? Like, I kept thinking there must be someone who'll go into these courts, play along, and then come back and report about the pervasiveness of abuse, whether it be in policing, the jails, the court system. But I really didn't see that happening. So I would really, in speaking to especially white researchers, I would say, why not? Maybe stop putting the lens on marginalized folks. And as I say in the book, why don't we put the lens and the gaze on people that create the conditions of marginality? And in some ways that automatically privileges a white researcher. But so far, I didn't really see many accounts that do that turn the tables on the traditional ethnographic gaze. And rather than, what I think Victor Rios calls it the Jungle Book ethnography. Everybody is fascinated by how the other half lives. And in the process, dehumanizes, sensationalizes poverty, pain, racism, creates more harm than good. And so I think that would be my one piece of advice for, how people can start to be critical and really focus the lens on people in power. And I think for, researchers of color, I say, Paul Butler is a law professor, and he talks about the legitimizing role, right? That when you're in the room, you in some ways legitimize what's happening. So it's not entirely impossible if you're darker and you can't pass. I don't think that's kind of a qualification or something to doing this type of work. Mm-hmm. I would say Paul Butler would say that your being in that room, if they start to do deplorable things, your job is to record that research, go deeper and find out more and why. I think the tough thing emotionally, at least it was for me, was that it felt complicit, because I felt complicit because I couldn't stop it. And I was seeing, if you see one of the court watchers, actually 3 of them saw a child be taken into a courtroom lockup. And she was fiddling with a cell phone and her mom was sitting right next to her. And as this was narrated from these court watchers that were, bringing back this data to me in the second phase of the study, I kept thinking, I felt so complicit. Like there was nothing I can do for that mother. I didn't even know her name. Her child was taken away from her. To me, it almost felt like in the days of lynching that your child could be taken away from you and you had no control as a Black mother. You had no control as a brown mother. That felt so powerful. So, I would say that researchers of color are important in this because I think we're asking the questions that many people have ignored. I think that's the first level. But the second part is to, heed warning that it comes with its own set of emotional baggage and burdens too, because it is very hard. And when you're in some ways in those spaces and performing what Paul Butler says is the legitimizing function, standing in there and maybe whites feeling, well, it's not that racist because I just did it in front of him or her and she didn't complain. Or they might even say to you, do you think that's that bad? And they want you to validate, right, what they said. Technically as sociologists, we're supposed to stand back and not interfere with that, right? And so on the one hand, there's kind of an ethics there. It's a balancing act. It's a balancing act to both fit into your field site or your ethnographic site, but yet not be complicit in the types of abuse that you may find.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's good advice. All right, so let's get into the book a little bit. And, for me, I feel like one of the more important contributions of your book, is really observing how racism kind of happens in everyday legal practices, right? A quote that stood out to me from your book is kind of what you said in the beginning of it, right? To set the precedent for what it was going to be like is like you said, as we will see, this book does not unearth rogue attorneys or racists, but it reveals court culture that thrives on racism to function efficiently, a complex culture that exists as its own social ecosystem, far from the oversight of accountability of the legal bar in the city at large. I think that's important because a lot of times when people, or even maybe you're trying to do this research or think about how a system or an institution may be racist, I think a lot of time they're looking for those stories of where you're pulling out, again, like these kind of rogue attorneys or these kind of blatant or explicit racists that are doing these things. But it seems like your main intent was just to show how just the everyday operations of the court system kind of reproduces this racism in many ways, in more subtle ways. So can you, just maybe share with our listeners some of the subtle ways, right, that racism was playing out and just the everyday functions of the court?
Yeah, I mean, so attorneys, one would think that that the worst quote unquote criminals, like people charged with attempted murder or violent crimes, would have been seen as the worst types of the worst element, if you will, coming into the court. But it was actually reversed. And this is, one of the things I argue is that racism really does turn logic on its head, right? There's a lot of, kind of cultural and ideological work necessary for these attorneys to make sense of what comes down to racism in a supposedly colorblind world. And, prosecutors feel very vindicated when they see a violent criminal, right? And it's kind of, they say, well, this is the purpose of our job. I'm trying to keep the streets safe and all these other things, right? They have those logics that make them feel good about the work that they do. But the reality is what they see is a stream of people charged with nonviolent crimes. And so it really, in some ways, throws into question their very mission and purpose in their work. And I think race, in some ways, acts as a really great scapegoat to make it all make sense, which is the prosecutors and judges mostly have created this word called mope. And it basically means the lazy, degenerate offender that is almost so lazy and degenerate that they're not even good at being, quote unquote, criminal. It has all the derogatory meanings as the N word, but they gave it a new name and call it something that's non-racial. And they continue doing that. And in some ways they blame this mope as what is wrong with the system, clogging up the system so that they can't get to the real criminals, the real cases, right? So they put those boundaries between themselves and the defendants. And so processing mopes as quickly as possible become the goal. You know, if you're dehumanized as a mope, that means you don't have rights, right? So in some ways, we're seeing this in the family separation at the borders right now, right? If you can code these families as being less than human, then it seems kind of okay, if you will, to the people charged with taking a baby away from a mother, right? And so in the same way, they didn't really they didn't really see a problem with skirting over people's due process rights or mocking them in open court or talking about them as though they're invisible. So you see like a probation officer one time, he's talking, pointing a finger at this gentleman that violated his probation. And I said to him, what is a mope? Like, tell me what a mope is, to this probation officer. He points to this young man that's literally sitting right there in earshot of us. And he goes, yeah, you see that guy? He's like, oh man, that ain't right. This shit ain't right. Why'd a judge be like that? So he flips into ebonics to, in some ways, embody the mope, right? In his perception of what ebonics or Black English vernacular is, right? This bastardization to dehumanize him and degrade him even more. And then he said, putting a guy like that is like throwing trash in the ocean. It just comes back to you. So again, coding the defendants, the mopes, when you went to go probe what is a mope and what types of things do they do, it was always a nonviolent offense. And then ultimately, when you dug deeper, there was always more violent racial language like trash and dirt and scum, and dogs, that allowed an enormous amount of what I would say traditional racism to be alive and well in that courtroom and to almost completely be entangled with the law and the legal processes and the criminal charges that we think are non-racial.
Yeah, that's really kind of sad to hear. It's kind of disturbing. So I know within this framework, when people think about the court system, a lot of the times prosecutors get the blame for most of the racial inequalities present within the courts. But your book highlights that prosecutors and defense attorneys, public defenders in particular, play a role in racist practices. So can you describe for our listeners some of the things you witnessed in regard to how both prosecutors and public defenders perpetuated these inequalities?
Yeah, well, the prosecutors, some of it seemed more obvious in the sense that for the prosecutors that they might perpetuate this sense of racial injustice and this racism. So the description of talking about mopes, that they coding certain types of defendants as being unworthy of rights, unworthy of time from the court, unworthy of a trial, for instance. And so I think the prosecutors really led that culture, and it was more the public defenders that had to be responsive to it. One of the things I talk about is there is a gruesome game that prosecutors used to play, and it was called the 2-ton game. And basically the way you won the 2-ton game is you convicted, and then they would say the N-word. So the prosecutors would have a competition. They would look at the rap sheet. They would see how much a defendant weighed. And if the person was heavy and they convicted that person, they'd create a tally. And the first person that could get to a ton would win the game. And they actually used the overt racial slur. And I apologize for your listeners, but I think it's important that we hear it. So they used to call this niggers by the pound. And when they started getting in trouble, they recoded it as mopes, or they stopped using those words. And they saw this as kind of the gallows humor. And I think, and never really interrogated how deeply racist it is, right? And so the prosecutors that are in my book are from a long line, if you will, of they inherit this culture. Right. Some of them are still of the legacy of those people playing that 2-ton game. And I think when public defenders have to fight that culture, they have to either, what is it like? You have to join them to beat them in some ways. So you do see public defenders using that very rhetoric to, in some ways, mask any sympathy for defendants, right? So you see public defenders in some ways say something like, well, I know my guy's a scum, but judge. And then the but is where they start to ask for something special for a person charged that has a family. Or I remember one defense attorney was trying to get money back that was confiscated at arrest. And a lot of times, they'll just seize everything. If you had anything in your pocket, a check, they're taking it all, cell phones. And sometimes it's people's rent money, right? And so a whole family could be affected by whatever's in your pocket during the moment of arrest. So the public defender knew he couldn't save the defendant, but he tries to save the mother. And he says, the mother's money. And he says, Judge, I really, there was money in the guy's pocket. And the judge was like, oh, come on. That's drug money. You're not getting it. I'm confiscating it for the state. And so he kind of says, oh, come on, Judge. It's mama's money. It's mama's money. So kind of racializing the mother and almost mocking her in this kind of mammy trope. Like she's not a real mother, right? She's a Black mother. And he comes up with this scheme to, in some ways, try to figure out if it's her money or the son's money. He ultimately ends up winning, but to win, he has to be racist. He has to perform a level of racism that to most readers, I hope, feels unsavory and raises those ethical questions in the classrooms, in courtrooms across America. Is this what we need to do to defend people in criminal courts across America? I would say, to me, this is one of the most deplorable things, is that the public defenders have to engage in almost like a surface level, a standard level of racism or racial tropes in order to be successful for their clients. Is that what we should be willing to do?
No, that's a really good question and a really good point for like you said, people who are even up and coming and wanting to be into the legal sector and legal practitioners and young lawyers. And, I'm just thinking of, the mindset and the perspective of them going through law school or excited to go through law school and how they imagine, they can be maybe even like kind of like a social justice warrior within the courtroom and upholding the integrity of justice. But then when you get in these settings, you have to kind of give some of that away, right? Or play the game so that you can win for your clients. But I can just imagine the internal, push and pull and the turmoil on a person.
And that's what, as I mentioned at the beginning about, as researchers, right? Like, what are we willing to do? I often used to say to myself, is this study worth it? Is this book worth it? Is being complicit worth it? And I'm sure that public defenders, maybe I think many of them probably imagine me doing a book that would just be critical of the prosecutors and judges, because that the games they played and the things they did are so egregious. But yet, shouldn't we also put that lens on how public defenders had to be complicit and the type of harm that they would create as well for their clients, that their hands were in some ways dirty too, and that if they really are interested in reform, then they have to also acknowledge that.
No, definitely. So, another thing that stood out to me in your book, right, and I think it's very important to discuss because if it has been being discussed for these past couple of years, and you highlight it in the section law bending and law breaking behavior, and in a few sections after that as well, where you kind of highlight like issues with like police brutality. Of course, you briefly mentioned Michael Brown, Tamir Rice in those cases, and even today, right, we're still seeing what's going on in Dallas with the both them Gene case and Amber Geiger and going on with that kind of stuff. And then, part of the major conversation and dominant conversation is, police officers. How does this operate in the court system? Why did they get off? Why did they not go to court? And you do highlight and talk about, how the closeness of prosecution and law enforcement plays a role in these type of cases.
Yes.
So what are some of the things you witnessed while you were, doing your research that can speak to what we see in these relationships?
Well, this book came out right when the video of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, when that entire news story erupted. And Laquan McDonald, for the listeners who may not know, he was a young man that was shot 16 times. There was multiple officers at the scene. He was surrounded. It looked like he had an object in his hand. It was unclear whether it was a gun, a knife, or some other type of thing. It was unclear. And he was kind of walking, ranting and raving, but not complying with officer instructions. The last officer to the scene is Jason Van Dyke. And within literally, you see the squad car video. He's driving kind of frantically through the city. The car stops. He immediately gets out and unloads the entire gun on this young man. It's so bad that literally Laquan McDonald's body is smoking. And I remember seeing that case, and they fired the chief of police. And I remember saying, that won't do anything. And I remember being like enraged, like so enraged that I felt like, if I don't speak up now, because it took a long time to research this book, right? This felt like it was like a decade in the making. And in a lot of ways, I kept thinking, well, who's going to believe me? So I really wrote this book being in absolute fear that despite all the data, that there was still going to be people saying, that's not happening. She doesn't know anything. What does she know? So I thought that. And so I took a leap of faith. I wrote my first op-ed ever. I pitched it to NBC News on a whim. I met the vice president of NBC News came to Temple University campus where I was employed at the time. I was a professor at the time. And I gave him a card and I said, when this book comes out, I would love to get linked with the local NBC affiliates. I didn't really think, what role could I play in this dialogue about police brutality? And so my first argument my first op-ed was just to educate the public that prosecutors in some ways enable police brutality. And how they do that is by, in some ways, looking the other way when police officers bring in cases that, kind of don't make sense, right? Where there is a suspect dead and the story doesn't really pass scrutiny. If it were any other type of witness, the prosecutor would interrogate that witness, but it's a police officer. And because the police is in charge of giving cases to the prosecutor, police become extremely scared to challenge any police officer's word. And so they, in some ways, used to even relinquish and say, well, it's my case now, but you always have to tell the officer it's really their case, right? It's their case. And so prosecutors were almost fearful of police. So the culture was so intertwined that you even have prosecutors, like the first warning I got about dealing with police officers was from a female prosecutor. And she says, I don't care what these police officers do not accept a date, or if they come on to you, do not allow them to advance, be very firm, but kind about how you reject them. And I remember thinking, why? And she had said to me, she's like, well, she told me this story about a female prosecutor who was stalked by the police. And she said to me, who are you going to call? The police? Saying like, don't get involved. It felt like the mafia. And so I watched very carefully as I saw some of the little tricks and tactics of the prosecutors and kind of playing nice with police. Not wanting to question officers, for instance, in separate rooms. So if you have a team of officers, an officer and their partner, the prosecutors would give them the case file, let them quote unquote refresh their memory as they walked out and got coffee. So again, would they do that for any other witness, or would they do that for just the police? The fact is that, prosecutors need police officers to win cases. If they don't win cases, prosecutors will not get promoted. So it's in some ways a self-selecting system where the prosecutors then that comply with police officers the most agreeable prosecutors will advance faster in the office. And therefore it selects people who don't make any noise or resist the police. And so that, really explaining that to the public felt instrumental in trying to show that Laquan McDonald and the officer Jason Van Dyke, there was more Laquan McDonald's is one of the first things I say. And there's absolutely more Jason Van Dykes. We just don't know their names. We just don't have prosecutors that have ever scrutinized those cases. And that's why you saw the chief prosecutor in Chicago, it took her 400 days to charge the officer that shot Laquan McDonald 16 times. And we had a video of it, right? And also police officers that were coercing witnesses at the scene. You don't have that level of cultural behavior unless you know that no one else is there in the court system, either prosecutors nor judges. that no one else is there to hold you accountable. You wouldn't have that behavior because they would be scared, right? It was a brazen culture. And I think understanding these courts and the police as an intertwined system, my hope is that small bit of knowledge will help change people's minds, both jurors and judges across America. My hope is that that's the legacy of that case, which is actually in trial right now. So it's been a busy, emotional week for the city of Chicago.
I have to say that makes me a little nervous about the Botham Jean case, considering the fact how that was handled over the weekend with making sure that the officer had her story together and she, had time to think about things. And that makes me a little afraid. But
yeah, it's just it is hopeful. The norm. I mean, there's all even unions have fought. Once some kind of a shooting happens, that some jurisdictions have time limits. Not time limits, but almost like a waiting period in which you can wait to question the officer. But to me, that's that's a crucial moment where you might wait to change your story. Like if you were any other person and shot and killed somebody on the street, they would bring you in immediately and you would have to talk and account for that. You wouldn't get days and time with an attorney to create a new narrative of that story. And so, again, I absolutely, when we see these cases over and over again, and the failure to receive justice in almost every single one of them, they're all linked to the fact that these prosecutors are so dependent on police officers that they are, they're indebted to them almost all the time. And so that to me was the main, one of the findings in some ways. It's not the main finding of the book, but it's definitely the one that got the most press attention on the Rachel Maddow show and the New York Times. But it's an important soundbite because then I hope that you can educate enough of the public, like jurors, to eventually start to make change in the minds of people. That police testimony, like any witnesses, police can lie.
Absolutely. So in thinking about everything you just talked about, and of course, everything else that's in the book, and I hope people pick it up because I'm pretty sure there's a lot that we didn't get to. So with everything you witnessed and learned from your research, what are some solutions or recommendations on how to fix this problem, to fix the racist operations of the court?
Well, I think one of the things that I realized during the data collection of the study was that, court watching was a really important part of kind of exposing racism. But I didn't think of it as a tool for social justice at all. I had worked in marketing for 5 years before I went to get my PhD, and we had sent in secret shoppers all the time to places like Hallmark and Disney. We would do quality controls and checks to see if people were being courteous, responsive, treating people with dignity, treating people like consumers, right, that had value and merit. So I kept thinking, well, is this a way that we can in some ways exert some influence? So I'd like to play around with, and what I suggest in the book at the end is, can we do court watching initiatives in jurisdictions across the nation? In some ways to hold accountable the court actors, right, as they do business. I think a lot of times when you read the book and you think about the egregious things that they're doing in open court, you have a judge sleeping on the bench during a trial, right? You have a judge passing out Girl Scout cookies to a defendant, right? Imagine how that looks to a victim, right? When you have those stories, if they knew that people from the outside were watching on a regular basis, would they behave that way? Or would they conduct themselves with the dignity that is expected of a criminal court in America? I think that could make some change. I've seen right now for folks that go on Twitter, there's a New York City court watching. It's called Court Watch NYC. They actually are importing some of the methods that I use in the book Crook County to actually do advocacy within New York City. They're tweeting their findings. They're also trying to report on judges that are poorly behaved on the bench. So I think, there's hope in that. I think there's something about oversight. We need to have more oversight. The other thing is I think the public education of potential jurors across America. I do not give up on the fact that writing op-eds and being an educator, my responsibility is not just to educating the students that I see in my lecture hall, right? My hope is to educate the voter, the juror. That's a slower process of reform, but I think one that over time can start to make a difference.
No, that's really cool. Yeah, I actually have a couple of my students interning with Court Watch program in Poughkeepsie.
Oh, great.
And so they really enjoy it. I think it's a really good start, right? One of the different ways. And I know people like, Sean King, activist who has the Real Justice PAC that are, trying to get people to get progressive DAs in office as well, right?
Yeah.
And elect them in these spots too. So it can begin to tackle some of these issues we've been seeing with this prosecutor relationships and police officers and things along those lines.
Yeah. So. I mean, I think actually when you said Poughkeepsie, I was thinking, are those the students at Vassar College, right? Or some folks in Vassar?
Yeah, some at Vassar, but my students are at SUNY.
Yeah. Well, at Vassar, I actually did the court watching training at Vassar College when I went up there for like a keynote. And everybody was really excited about this idea of doing court watching, right? That's and again, like I remember, Sean King had done like a 10-part series on reforming policing in America. And I remember emailing him and saying, please do not leave out prosecutors. You cannot reform policing in America until you know that prosecutors are the ones that hold a lot of the power, that they absolutely could tomorrow. Like there's good things happening though. I mean, one of the good things that, in terms of, maybe having the listeners know that there's some hope is what felt really empowering is that the series of op-eds I did. So the op-ed I did first for the the NBC News was called Anita's Army, Rank and File Racism and the Power to Prosecute. That was flying around the internet, and it made me so proud because here is this critical race message being disseminated on a mainstream, right, national network news. So that felt really powerful, and it allowed me to be able to talk on TV about the findings. And it did catch fire so that protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters can in some ways, they knew about the findings in my book and they could point to the data and say, see, it's not just our lived experience. There is a researcher, there's a professor here that is showing you data on what is happening and how prosecutors are enabling it. And they ended up, through that activism, they ended up single-handedly ousting Anita Alvarez, who was the prosecutor. Only 2 prosecutors that year in America were ousted. It was the prosecutor involved in Chicago in the Laquan McDonald shooting, and it was the prosecutor involved with Tamir Rice, right? A vulnerable little boy. So to me, that gives me hope, which is we do have the power, especially as researchers. If you have data that shows abuse, if you get it out there and make sure that you are making enough noise, you are empowering protesters that are literally putting their bodies on the line, you are doing a great service and you can have change. And, Kim Foxx became the new prosecutor. First, I think she's the first Black woman in that role. It's not perfect, right? She has a lot of hurdles, and all the people in my book, here's the scary part. She inherited them. She's a reformer that inherited the people that are profiled, kind of namelessly profiled in my work. However, she now has a do not call list where she does not call certain officers who know to commit police perjury, who test a lie. She is clamping down on that. She has reviewed drug cases where she believes wrongful convictions may have occurred, and she's releasing people from prison. So there is a start, right? Like we see that. And here in Philadelphia, it's very similar. We had the election of Larry Krasner, who's considered a progressive prosecutor. And so there's a lot of hope. He also has a do not call list. He came into the office and quite controversially fired, I think, about 20 prosecutors. And the sense was these were prosecutors that were really tight with police in a very unhealthy way. And he kind of cleaned house before he could get down to business. It shows there's hope even during these really rough and tumultuous political times.
Yes, for sure. There is hope, and we just got to hold on to that. Do you have any new projects, any new research you're working on that we should be on the lookout for?
Yes, I'm so excited. So my first, I felt like there was a missing piece of Crook County, and that was all the data and observations that I did on the Cook County Jail. And if your listeners know anything about the Cook County Jail, it is the largest single site jail in America. It's the size of 72 football fields. And it's astounding because it's in the middle of an American city like Chicago. I think going to that courthouse, seeing that ominous jail all the time that literally sat near Little Village, which is where my family is from, a little Mexican neighborhood that's called, so people think of it as like the Mexico of the Midwest is the nickname. To me, the stories that were coming in and out of that jail were powerful. I was hearing from defendants and from professionals alike that sheriffs were purposely releasing defendants into gang territory in the depths of night so that they would get jumped. Little regard for safety, human life, releasing people without jackets or bus passes, hoping they'd fend for themselves. And it felt like unfinished business. And so I basically went back to the Crook County courthouse and the adjacent jail. And I did a series of nights following people home in and around the Crook County jail. And in some ways trying to talk about how the suffering that happens in that jail bleeds out into the streets and into the communities itself. And so I have a new piece out called The Waiting Room. It's a part of Amazon Original Stories. And if you have Amazon Prime, it is downloadable for free. It's basically a Kindle book or, a story that you can listen to like a podcast, almost like Serial. And it's part of a cluster of a bunch of stories. Natalie Moore is doing one called The Payback on John Burge and the torturing of 130 Chicago citizens, Black men, that were ultimately given reparations. There's a profile on Kim Fox. So it's really a great, like a 5-part series. And mine, The Waiting Room, really speaks to this arduous process of being jailed in America and how it really punishes not just the defendants, the people held in that jail cell, but everybody, the families, the communities, anybody who knows and loves them. And I try to humanize that story. So hopefully people will read that. It tells, a lot of the tales of abuse that are in Crook County. It just shows how they're endemic in the jail system. It's probably not surprising. And in one case, I was doing an interview for Crook County on the local PBS station. And they said, there was a Supreme Court justice from Illinois that did court watching in bond court. She saw a woman brought out into open court wearing nothing but a garbage bag. She was mentally ill, homeless, and the sheriffs hadn't even bothered to clothe her. And I think it was that moment when I heard that story and felt like I had something to tell on this issue. And I felt like there's a lot of reform rhetoric going on in Chicago about that jail and about Tom Dart. And some of that is true. But I think the lived experience is much more nuanced and much more heart-wrenching than what he's trying to make out in the media.
Nice. I have to check that out for sure.
I definitely want to check it out. And it's great that this work is accessible to the public. So we'll definitely link that following the interview.
Thank you.
Speaking of links, is there a place where people can find you? Besides the work you just mentioned, are you on Twitter?
Yes, I am on Twitter, and all this upcoming week, I'll be tweeting about the Laquan McDonald trial and following along with everyone else. My Twitter handle is N Van Cleave, NVANCLEVE, and they can follow me on NicoleVanCleave.com as well.
Nice. Well, we'd like to thank you, Dr. Van Cleave, for taking out the time to come talk to us about your work and your book. We'll definitely, for those of our listeners, check it out, buy it. It's a really good book, and follow the work with Dr. Van Cleave. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. All right, Dad, so what you think about Dr. Van Cleave in Crook County?
I just have to say that I appreciate her putting this knowledge out there so that people can just be a little bit more informed about how the systems work and, potentially where they fit in. Like she mentioned the jury and making sure that jurors are aware of what's happening. So I just really appreciate that. She spent the time doing this research and just putting it out there for people.
Yeah, no, this is one of the important things about having and doing this type of research and qualitative research, because you catch a lot of things that you won't catch, right? With just one, you're not going to catch stuff with just numbers. I mean, of course, we understand that there's racial inequality present, but then it can be easily denied, right? Because if you look at the way we courtrooms operate and the formal procedures and the formal documents. Of course, you're never going to have these terms that they use informally to describe people of color or people from certain backgrounds or communities, right? That go on in the language that's used and the mocking and the games that they play, like the 2-ton game. That's never going to show up in paperwork. So it can be easily denied. And it's with this kind of research to say, hey, yes, okay, quantitatively, we see the numbers. And now qualitatively, right, or through this ethnographic research, we see that it is still very much prevalent in the culture of these courtrooms and how people operate and have conversations with one another. So I think, there is still value and there will always be value in this type of research. And so I'm glad she did what she's been doing.
Numbers cannot tell you the entire story. It just cannot. I also thought it was interesting because I was like, I wonder, could I have captured that given my, phenotype? Like, I'm a dark-skinned Black woman. There are certain things, like she mentioned, kind of having access to some of this information because of how she looked. And so it made me think about my own dissertation project and the issues I'm facing. But that's another day, another story. But, I will say that I'm happy she kind of called out the role of the public defender in perpetuating inequality in the system without going into too much detail. I actually know someone who, recently had an experience with a public defender. It was a non-violent, offense that, should have just kind of like went away. And the public defender really tried to pressure this person to just plead to something that could have had really negative consequences, for their career and things of that nature. And, thank goodness this person could afford a private attorney and was able to, do this process where the case is being dismissed. But how many people can not afford a private attorney and are stuck with a public defender, who's not like Ashley, who we interviewed and who really cares, but is a public defender that's really just trying to get you through because, they don't really care about this case.
Yeah, even in her book in Crook County, she had asked questions to public defenders and private attorneys, right? Just even the question of, do you believe that defendants are treated fairly in the court, regardless of their race or class? And, most of the public defenders said no, right? That they're not treated fairly and they're representing this population, but yet still are contributing to this, right? Even with this understanding. So it's this kind of weird relationship that's going on that, we're aware of it, but are in a position where they really seem to not be able to affect, to reverse the changes and the outcomes of it. So that's interesting. Yeah, and time and time again, like we said, we've had conversations about this in the past. Private attorneys are privileged in the courtroom. More than likely than not, you're going to get the outcome you want when you have a private attorney. But again, majority of the people who are involved in the system just don't have the money or resources to do that. So it kind of sucks. And even in her book, she talked on things like pretrial services and people sitting behind bars because they can't afford bail, which has been another issue that she highlights in the book and is problematic too, because you're already poor, you're already probably working a minimum wage job, and now you may be innocent, but you can't get out of jail, and now you can't go to work, and now you lose your job, right? And all these things that happen because of that, just because you can't afford to get out. A lot of issues. A lot of sad things.
One last thing I appreciate is her just pointing out how dependent on police officers that, prosecutors and the courts are, and how you have to, kind of play into, what they want from you. You have to just walk on eggshells because they can make or break your cases. And it just makes me think, like, how many times have justice not been served, especially when a police officer is involved, like in a case? How many times have justice not been served because, the prosecutors are far too concerned with, not making enemies with police officers?
And we know, we see it, what's been going on. And yeah, it's like this weird relationship. I feel like they are too close because just thinking from how, like she said, the relationship between prosecutors and police officers work is that, you rely a lot of the prosecutor's evidence relies on police officer testimony and all that kind of stuff, or providing evidence. So if you begin to, I guess, combat or go against police officers, then that also opens, this kind of Pandora's box of, hey, you also said these police officers are corrupt or bad, as a defense attorney, right? And so how can we, support this evidence or take this as, truth from what they're saying and what they're doing? So I think that's another reason why prosecutors also stand away from it, is because if we poke too many holes or show corruption, then that means the evidence we get from them are also going to get holes poked in them and seem corrupted as well. So we need to figure out a way to fix that and just, have a prosecutor and police officer have them more distance in their relationship and how they navigate.
Yeah.
But other than that, we'd like to thank Dr. Van Cleave for coming out, taking out the time to come chat with us. Pick up her book, check out her work for sure. We're definitely posting on everything. As always, continue to follow us on social media at BHD Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Check out our latest stuff out on our website, www.blackandhighlydangerous.com. Email us at bhdpodcast@gmail.com. Any questions you have, topics, ideas, maybe even being a potential guest, definitely continue to do that. Even if you want to be a guest for one of our current event episodes, do that. And review, rate us, share us with your friends, share us with your enemies, share us with your family. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.